Congratulations on your new job. Why don't you tell everybody what your new job is at ARP? Chris has been around for a good while, but he's got a new position.
Sure. Thank you, Mary, and thanks to so many of you for sticking around, and hope this will be at least a little bit beneficial for you. But as Mary mentioned, I've been with AARP for I guess a little over 4 years now, and I moved from Associate State Director of Advocacy up to the manager role for our state and federal advocacy with AARP North Carolina after Lisa Regal, who I'm sure many of you know, retired herself. So have just a great opportunity and wonderful blessing to be able to continue to work for such a great organization. And a large part of my role does involve being down at our North Carolina General Assembly, and specifically working on state advocacy that impacts older adults, which as you can imagine, and as I'm sure many of you know, there's a lot of things that can fall under that category. So we do work on a lot. But today I wanted to specifically just give some background and talk a little bit about the legislative process in North Carolina, and just a little bit about how things work at the state level when it comes to doing things like introducing legislation, actually getting a bill through committee to become law, which is certainly no easy task. So we'll spend a little bit of time going through some general, fairly basic things about how our legislature is set up. And then I'll save some time at the end to try to answer any questions I can, or have Mary answer them for me, because she's way smarter than I am. So we can go ahead and get going. Carrie, if you want to go to the next slide for me here. Okay, so our North Carolina General Assembly, or is also often referred to the legislature, is made up of two bodies or two chambers. We have the North Carolina State House, and then we have the North Carolina State Senate. And our State House is composed of 120 members. Our State Senate is composed of 50. So altogether, from the 100 counties that North Carolina has, we have 170 members of our state legislators. So of the 120 members in the State House, currently right now 72 of them are Republican, and then in the State Senate, of the 50 members of the State Senate, currently right now 30 of them are Republican. And we'll talk about in a minute why both those numbers are important with the way things are structured with our state legislature. And every 2 years, or when elections are held for the North Carolina General Assembly, and every single person is up for re-election every 2 years. So everyone is on the ballot every 2 years, regardless of whether they're in the Senate or in the State House. You can go ahead to the next slide. So just a few facts on sort of setting the stage here for interacting with legislators and some North Carolina specific things. So every state is very different with how they run their state government and their state legislature. And so some states have full-time legislators, and they are there, sort of like Congress, pretty much all the time. North Carolina, we claim to have a part-time legislator, but I really don't know. Recent history is sort of indicative that we claim part-time, but we keep our folks there sometimes for most of the year. And despite that, their salary, which you can see I put in quotes because it's I'm really not sure it should even be considered that, is just under $14,000 a year. So because of that, as you can imagine, many folks who serve at the state level are either retired folks or folks that have some wealth already, so that they can afford to be able to do this, or perhaps they do have they're blessed to have an employer that allows them to have some really, really good flexibility. But for the most part, you don't see a ton of people that are serving at the state level who also have, another full-time job back home in their district, because there's just no way you can juggle both those things when you're supposed to be in Raleigh for so much of the year. So I bring this up to say that in North Carolina, it's important to know that we do somewhat limit, in my opinion, the pool of who's able to actually run for state office, given that salary level. And that's not the same in every state. There are some states, for example, in New York, that pay, over $100,000 a year to their state legislators. Now, of course, they are full-time, legislative body, but still, it's very different in other places. So you can go ahead to the next slide. Just wanted to provide some background there. Typically when session convenes, which if you've watched any local North Carolina news at all this past week, I'm sure you've heard our short session started on Wednesday, the 23rd. And when session convenes, typically legislators will arrive Monday evenings, and then sessions usually start fairly early on Tuesday mornings, and then run until Thursday afternoons, because typically you're going to see legislators head home for the weekend. And again, you have to think, you have some coming from, the far Murphy to Manteo, right? So you have some coming from the far western part of the state. You have some coming from far eastern part of the state to Raleigh. So they do their best to allow time for folks to be able to get home. Again, they meet over a 2-year period. Because we are in an even numbered year, that is why we are in the short session right now. I do joke the short session, sort of, to me, referring to it as that is a little funny, because our last couple of short session cycles have been anything but short. They have gone on for months and months and months. But typically the goal of a short session is to do things like tweak the budget when the new revenue forecast comes in, and then take care of unfinished business from the long session. But there are only certain bills that are eligible during the short session, and they have to be bills that have met certain criteria from the previous year. So in general, the goal, though, and I've spoken to several legislators going into this short session, the goal is usually to try to be finished around 4th of July holiday. But again, they've had a goal like that before, and they've gone late into the summer, even into the early fall. So you never know for sure, depending on what issues may end up being introduced and sparking a lot of debate. You can go ahead to the next slide, Karen. Great. Okay. So this was sort of where I wanted to get in depth into a little detail. So bills can be drafted really by anybody, but they have to be introduced by a legislator, and then they can turn into drafted legislation. But a member of the General Assembly has to introduce a bill, and introducing it means that it has to be filed with the principal clerk on the previous workday, at which time it receives a bill number. And when the reading clerk reads the bill aloud, then the bill has passed its first reading. Typically, then the bill will be sent to an appropriate committee. So whatever the bill, subject matter is about, they will then usually decide, okay, this bill needs to go to the committee on blank. So we'll look at it in some examples on a future slide. But if the bill is approved, then from that committee, it may go to another committee that relates to the work of the bill as well. If it receives a favorable report or approval from that committee, the bill then may go to the floor of either the House or the Senate for a full vote. Within these committees, things called amendments can be added to the bill, and amendments will, obviously make some type of change to the bill. So there could be some sort of thing that legislators like the bill in general, but there's a little tweak they want to make. There's one thing they want to pull out of the bill. There's one or two little things they want to add to the bill. Amendments can also be offered on the floor and in committee and be rejected by the committee or on the floor based on that majority vote that I mentioned before. Obviously, with Republicans holding the majority. You can go ahead to the next slide here. So after a bill goes through one chamber, so it's gone through a couple of committees. The committees have given it a favorable report. Then it goes to the full chamber. Say it goes to the House for a full floor vote. The House passes it. Then it moves to its third and final reading. After it passes that third and final reading, it's sent to the other chamber. So if it passes the House, then it goes to the Senate. And this process sort of starts all over again. So the Senate will receive the bill. The Senate will stick it in a committee that typically, again, relates in some way to the subject matter that the bill is about. That committee will have some discussion, some debate on the bill. They will decide whether there are any amendments that they would like to add to the bill. They will then recommend whether that bill moves forward. They may then send it to an additional committee where the same thing will happen. Then if things are continuing to move well, the bill will then go to the floor of the second chamber. So in this example, let's say the Senate. The Senate will then have a vote on that bill. If it passes the floor of the Senate, if there's any changes at all, any little amendments added, whatever, it will go back to the House again for them to do what's called a concurrent vote. At times they may have to hash out, a couple little small differences. If they are able to do that successfully, then the bill has passed both chambers. It will go to the governor's desk, and the governor will then decide whether or not to sign that bill into law or to veto that bill. Or actually, the governor has a third option, which is to allow that bill to simply sit on his desk for a certain amount of days, and then it can become law. So those are the three options that the governor has. So if that sounds like a rather long process and a little bit complicated and a little bit cumbersome, well, hey, it is. And it's sort of designed to work that way on purpose for a number of reasons. So I think the next slide, Carrie, if you can scroll down, I think I have this massive graphic here, and I know this is hard to see, and the slides certainly have been shared or will be shared, but this really displays from sort of a flowchart perspective how things start and how lengthy the process can be to go through for something like a bill to actually become law. But like I said, it is designed that way for a purpose and for a reason. So you want many voices to be at the table. You want debate on a bill. You want different perspectives. And we know folks in, one part of North Carolina may have a different view than folks in another part of North Carolina on a certain issue. You want those voices in that debate to be heard. You want different perspectives to be heard. And you don't want just willy-nilly anything that one person has as an idea to necessarily be able to become the law of the state. So it is certainly designed this way on purpose. It does make our work, it makes getting a bill passed and becoming law, certainly makes it challenging. It also makes it extremely rewarding if and when you're able to do it, because it is a long process. And as an example, last year during the long legislative session, there were, I believe, just under 8,000. I forget, I had this number memorized last year. I believe there were just under, maybe between 7,000 and 8,000 bills. I feel like it was just under 8,000 bills that were introduced during the long session. And of those, I believe 80 something actually became law. So if that gives you an idea of how many bills are introduced and then how many actually work their way through the process and become law. And I don't share all of this at all to be discouraging about the process. I simply share it to say it is a lengthy process. You have to know, it's good to be aware of what you're dealing with and the steps you have to go through in the legislative process. I also share it to sort of go back to what we talked on earlier this morning, which is that relationships are so critical. with legislators, because as you can see, you have to go through committees. Having a relationship with somebody who sits on a certain committee can be so important to being able to move that bill through committee, or figuring out what is needed, maybe changes or tweaks are needed to get that bill through a committee. So incredibly important. Can't emphasize enough, as Mary stated this morning, that the power of relationships with folks from across, on both sides of the aisle when it comes to being able to actually get a bill through the legislative process to become law in North Carolina. You can go ahead, Carrie. Thank you. So I wanted to just touch on for a minute here the current sort of makeup of our North Carolina General Assembly. So as I mentioned earlier, our state House, of the 120 members, 72 are Republican. That is, won't get into the drama here, but that is in part because there was one Democrat last year who actually switched her party affiliation to Republican, and that gave Republicans in the state House what is called a supermajority. So not just a simple majority anymore, but they now have a supermajority by that one single vote, 72. In the Senate, the Republicans also have a supermajority, controlling 30 of the 50 seats. And so what that means is if the governor, Governor Cooper, who is a Democrat, vetoes a bill that was largely or totally a Republican-backed bill, the General Assembly, as it currently stands, if every single member is present of the Republican Party, has enough votes to be able to do what is called a veto override, where they are able to override the governor's veto and allow that bill to become law without his signature, essentially. So that is where we are in our state right now. It is important to know that, and for a number of reasons, it limits the governor's power, and the governor of North Carolina, regardless of which party is in control. Already we have one of the sort of least powerful governors in our state, with the way our state constitution is set up, and just some of the powers that the governor has here versus that are expanded in other states. So our legislative branch, in other words, which I have been speaking on, is much more powerful here in North Carolina than many other states. And again, that's just something that everyone should be aware of. When we look at things like bill sponsors, and this is getting a little bit more into strategy, but in my opinion, it's really important to look for bipartisanship. It's really important to try to get folks from both sides of the aisle on board to feasibly get something done in North Carolina. We are a state that is very much a purple state. If you look at the political demographics of North Carolina, it's pretty interesting. We're almost evenly divided between a third affiliated, a third Democrat, and a third Republican. And I think that there's some reflection of that, from ARP's perspective with our membership as well. So we look very strategically to try to work in bipartisan ways over at the North Carolina General Assembly. You can go ahead to the next slide. And so I've talked a little bit about this, but and I don't want to belabor it too much, but I want to encourage everybody to visit NCLEG, that's ncleg.gov, because there is so much excellent information there. You can see so many different things about the way our state legislature operates. You can pull bills, you can get status updates on what's going on with the bills. You can go back and look at past bills. You can see who sponsors were of bills. You can read the bill text. And then if there's amendments added to the bill, you can see what they were and how they changed the bill. Even more importantly, it is the place to go to find who your legislators are currently. And in North Carolina, with the new maps we have, who your legislators may be in the future. What district you're in now, but what district you may be in come January of 2025, which for many of us, myself included, I'm in one district now and will be in a different district come next year because of redistricting, which seems to happen way too often in this state. So you can scroll down a little bit here, Carrie. I wanted to just show an example here of a bill that ARP worked on several years ago. And this was more of a study committee bill, but you can see as you scroll down here, you can see all the steps in the process of getting a bill signed into law. So you can see here that this bill was filed on the 4th of April in 2019. It passed its first reading 4 days later. And then you can see all the different steps that it went through. It went through, this certain committee on pensions and retirement, and then another committee, and then finally went to the House floor, and then was sent to the Senate. And it again repeated similar situation, went to a committee in the Senate, and then another committee in the Senate. So just sharing this here to show you kind of, especially for visual learners, what I was speaking of earlier, the process of that bill getting to become law. You can scroll down some more, Carrie. Thank you. And so here's sort of the final, it's 2 pages here worth of process, but it's worth seeing. You can see in the Senate, it finally passes its 3rd reading. Then it goes back to the House because there was an amendment that was offered in the Senate. So the House had to then concur with that amendment, agree with that amendment, and then it was finally sent to the governor's desk in a process that started, as you saw, on the 4th of April in 2019, ended up being signed by the governor on the 27th of August in 2019. And that was actually, that actually moved fairly quickly, all things considered. So it is a process, and I just wanted folks to be able to actually see it here, an example of what that process can look like. All right, you can scroll down a little more, Carrie. So I already sort of touched on this, but I just wanted to show an example. This was the North Carolina state budget in 2019. The governor vetoed that budget, so you can see there, sort of at the top of the page, you can see in red, governor veto of House Bill 966. He has a little stamp. He put his veto stamp on that bill when it reached his desk, sent it back to the North Carolina General Assembly. In this case, the General Assembly had a supermajority, and so they were able to then override that veto with 3/5 of both chambers voting in favor to make that budget bill become law. And that was the situation then. Democrats actually broke that supermajority for a cycle, but Republicans now have it back again currently by the slimmest of margins, as I mentioned. So if there's one Republican who is sick or out in either chamber, they do not have that supermajority. Okay, you can scroll on down, Carrie. And again, this is just an example again of what that veto override looked like. So it's sent back to the North Carolina state legislature, and then you can see they hold the veto override votes in both chambers in order to be able to make that happen. Okay, you can go ahead and scroll down. I think I'm almost finished here. And again, I just wanted to plug the ncleg.gov, the North Carolina state legislature's website. You can find any and everything there. On the first part of the front page is the legislative calendar. You can see exactly what committees are meeting, what bills may be up for debate or discussion. One of the silver linings of COVID, I would say, is it used to be you could only listen live on the North Carolina General Assembly website. Now you can actually stream and watch a lot of different both committee sessions as well as when a bill may be getting debated on the floor. So it's certainly not quite C-SPAN, but it is pretty good for the good old North State here. So that's a nice thing to be able to do for those who aren't able to be in Raleigh. I utilize it sometimes myself when I'm not able to be down there. And then the last thing I'll plug is you can view all of the committees, all the different committees on the North Carolina State Legislative website. And so if there's certain committees, such as Committee on Health and Human Services, for example, if there's certain committees that may appeal to you, the issue area may appeal to you, you can pop in your email on the when you go to the committee page, and it will send you an email every single time that committee is meeting. It will give you an advance notice. We'll share what you can click and see what the agenda will be. So if there's something that may be relevant to you that you are interested in, I highly recommend doing that, because sometimes it's hard to keep up otherwise with what committees may or may not be meeting certain days and times. So I have several that I get updates for right now with them in session. Usually, every day I'm getting an email from a certain committee letting me know it's meeting. So recommend that as well. I think that's all I have here. I'm happy to, here's just a couple of resources I used for this presentation that, again, you can click on in the slideshow when you have these slides. But I know I'm right at 12:30 now, but I wanted to hold some time for any questions that anybody has. So,
Chris, this is Mary. I'll just make a jaded comment. You did a great job of doing that. But when somebody like you that's been around for a while, the legislative process, we all talk about the way the process works with committees and, passing chambers and things like that. The reality is, if the right legislator wants something to happen, it will get done. You see things all the time where policy issues that might traditionally be in bills get put into the budget bill. This is particularly true of controversial things that you're afraid that would not pass if it's a standalone bill. But if you put something in the budget, then that means that you either vote for the budget or you don't vote for the budget with that controversial thing in there. So lots of times people have to hold their nose and vote for the budget, even though they might consider a poison pill thing in there. You also see things like when it gets down, particularly at the close of session, where if the right legislator wants something done, they will take a bill that was, say, was related to fish in North Carolina, that no action was taken on in that session. They will take that bill, totally gut it, and will insert what they want to happen. Maybe that bill's already passed one house. Well, they just do a committee substitute for what they would like to have in there. And then it goes, it goes through the process and gets through. So there are lots of little tricks to the trade that legislators know how to do things. And the bottom line is, if the right legislator wants something done, it will get done, and it can get done very quickly. So that's my jaded comment.
yes, Mary, that's a great point. And I will add, there's a reason why many legislators either currently are or retired attorneys. They do know how to operate a lot of different scenarios like that. And just to give an example, Medicaid expansion, which we got done last year, that was indeed connected to the budget. So as Mary said, there was a number of things that Governor Cooper wasn't real excited about that were in our state budget, including some that stripped additional power away from the governor. But because Medicaid expansion was included in there, and the budget had to be included in the budget to become law, the governor ultimately ended up signing the budget because of it. So that's just a great point. Woody?
Had to make sure I was unmuted. You skipped over on one of your slides about co-sponsors and the period of time that they could sign on. As was mentioned earlier, we have a bill that's House Bill 915 that's having its first reading actually Monday. How many days? It said 24 hours and then said a couple of days. How many days do we have to get additional co-sponsors? Is it 2 or 3?
That's a good question, Woody. I think it's usually 48 hours. If there's a hard rule, I don't know it by heart. I know for some bills we've introduced in the past, we've usually had 2 days to get it done. Certainly, obviously before the first reading, you're going to have that finalized. But in general, I think it's about 48 hours. Maybe more like 3 days. Ben, who's on the call, may know the hard rule better than I do.
I don't know the hard rule. It's a good question. I think you're right. It seems like the 48 hours I might have heard, but typically, quickly. Mary?
I think that I could be wrong on this, but every session has their rules that the House and Senate establish the rules. And I believe that's one of the things that they put into the rules. If I'm not wrong, also, you two guys would know better than me. Sometimes chambers will put in how many bills that legislators can sponsor or co-sponsors. So, they have to pick and choose what issues they will put forward. So somebody might be supportive of something, but if they've already reached their maximum about how many they can sponsor or co-sponsor, they wouldn't be able to do it. So I've had legislators refer me to other legislators to sponsor something, even though they would be for it. They just can't do it because of that provision.
That's exactly right. That happens often down there, that somebody wants to be a sign-on or be a primary and they just can't because they have a limit.
So are you saying that with the first reading on 9/15 coming up Monday, we have to have the co-sponsors before it's the first reading, or we have 48 hours after the first reading?
I'm fairly certain it's before the first reading, Woody, but I tell you what, let me see if I can dig into the rules that are set before each session that Mary mentioned and see if I can get you the exact answer to that here sometime a little later this afternoon.
Okay, because I know looking at the calendar, it's actually rather than Monday afternoon, they actually say they're convening at 10 a.m. Monday, which is probably just a formality to count it as a day. But I know we're trying to reach out to get some Republican co-sponsors, and it sounds like we need to get them this weekend.
Yeah, I would certainly be pushing for it this weekend, before Monday, as much as I could if I were in your shoes, for sure. But like I said, if I can locate the rules, I'll be happy to get them to you just so you have an exact answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yep. Kent? You're on mute, Kent.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
As I said, the legislature is bicameral, as is every state legislature in the country except Iowa, because senators used to represent geographic areas rather than people, and that was overturned by Supreme Court decisions. It was since said that trees don't vote, people vote. So now they all have to have population equity. So now the Senate, as the House has always been, is based on population rather than geography.
Yep. Great. Yeah. Great. Good. Thanks for bringing that up, Kent. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Anybody else? Well, thanks for staying on late for me this afternoon, guys.
Yeah. I think a good point, Chris, that you brought up is that generally it's a complicated process to get legislation passed. And that's probably, good because it does allow debate and input and refining as things go along. It doesn't always happen, but the intent is certainly good.
Yeah, and I will say too, as much of the partisan bickering and everything that we observe in news and media and everything like that, probably 90% of the bills that actually go through the North Carolina State Legislature are bipartisan. It's a high percentage. They actually agree on a lot more than you and I might think. They're just not excited. They're just not bills that make the headlines, and so folks just aren't seeing them.
And one thing that the General Assembly has a lot of control over is local issues. And those bills can be brought up at any time, even in the short session. And people don't realize that, say, for instance, a municipality wants to do rezoning type stuff and change some, basic things about how they operate. They got to get General Assembly approval to do that. So sometimes sometimes the General Assembly will introduce things that municipalities don't want and pass it through too. So it's an interesting process that people don't realize kind of the breadth and depth of things that our General Assembly does control. And as Chris, I mean, a point that I really thought a great point you made, Chris, is that North Carolina, when it comes to just about every other governor in the country, our governor has very weak powers. And, you know, and that happens when you have super majorities that, you know, can, and you've got a divided you've got a legislator that controls the legislative branch and say a person of another party in the executive branch. So
right.
it makes for interesting dynamics in North Carolina, that's for sure.
It does, and there's a lot of governors across the country that have what's called a line item veto, not to bore everybody to death, but that essentially allows the governor to veto certain parts of a bill, but not all of it, which really increases their power. And I saw Rosalind, I think, dropped a question in the chat. I'll just real quick answer that one about what crossover is. So during the long session, which obviously in this case was last year, both the House and the Senate will set a certain date for crossover for bills. And essentially what that means is for the bills to still be eligible during the next year's short session, they have to have passed either the House or the Senate. But as Mary said, there's a lot of different ways sort of around crossover. So it is a rule in place to try to weed out some of the, you know, hundreds of bills that are introduced, as I said, but there's still ways for folks to introduce things during the short session if they are going and talking to the right legislators. But generally speaking, a bill needs to pass one of two chambers in order to be eligible for the short session, either the House or the Senate, or it needs to have some sort of fiscal note. So think money funding attached to it for it to still be eligible during the short session.
And when we say short session, I mean, I think Chris went over the fact that sometimes it's not real short, but we have heard that we think this is going to be a real short session. And the reason why is this is an election year, and there's certain campaign finance laws in North Carolina that basically have to do with being able to collect funds or campaign and do things during, you know, when you're in session that you can't do when you're in session that you can do when you're not in session. So, and there are some fairly contested, you know, elections going on in the state this time. So they want to get out of town quickly. But if you saw that list that we sent out yesterday, and of all the news stories that have been going on about things legislature might be addressing this short session, some of those things are not without controversy. So it will be interesting to see where things stand.
Representative John Bell was quoted a couple of weeks ago as stating, and he's the House Majority Leader, that he thought the deadline that they would be shooting for would be the end of July this year.
Yeah, I've heard a couple different things. I've heard end of July, early July, but I know they certainly want to be done with some time left in the summer if possible.
Well, Chris, you did a great job. I saw comments in the chat. I think you're getting great reviews there. So you need to carry your show on the road.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to being with many of you on May 7th. I think it's going to be a fun day. So,
right. Carrie, you have any last words?
No, I'm just really appreciative that I got to be part of the educational session. I think it's always good to get a good deep dive. So thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Well, thanks again, Chris. And you guys have a great day. Look forward to seeing many of you on May 7th. Take care.